I guess for the people who've joined us so far, there's the numbers are going up, so that's great. Thanks very much for giving us your time and joining us. This is the second in our series of Impero talks. Last week, if you joined us, we talked about MPD launches, and we heard from the marketing director of Union Hand Roasted Coffee, who shared her experiences of past failures, but then also successes in relation to product launches. Today, we are going to be talking about being creatively brave and actually what that means. And it's not necessarily about taking maximum risk, but reducing those risks in order to do so. And then next week, we're going to be covering off Gen Z and how to win over that demographic, which for some brands out there is very much the next generation of their consumers. So I'm Corris from Impero, and today Michael, who is the agency owner and the ECD, will be running you through the presentation. We've also got our new CSO, Chris Tyus, who will be joining us for a quick Q&A session after the presentation. So if you've got any questions throughout, then there is a Q&A tab on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So feel free to ask any questions and we'll kind of address those at the end. So with that said, I'm just going to pass you over to Michael that's going to crack on into this presentation. Cheers. Thanks again.
Great. Morning, everybody. I'll crack straight in, but I hope everyone is safe and well out there. And thanks for joining. So today's talk, we're going to talk about managing creative risk, how to make the right decisions when judging whether work should enter the world, and trying to isolate that sort of sweet spot between blandness, which obviously gets forgotten, and outrageousness, which just causes controversy and doesn't really help a brand at all. So I'm going to talk about how, as a sort of creative director, I've sort of built some techniques around that, which I hope will kind of be helpful for everyone out there to try and assess the right amount of risk that they need to be taking to make sure they have effectiveness in all their campaigns. And I'm going to show you at the end a really, really super simple strategy. It's the most simple strategy we've created for minimizing risk while still having impact in a campaign. I've got a couple examples to show you how it works, but as I say, it's one of the most simplest ways you can possibly do that. I need to work out how this is going to work. So, first of all, I'm a creative director and founder of the agency Impero. So I know it's a little bit sort of trite and a little bit sort of almost juvenile, I'd say, for me to stand up here as a creative director and tell you, like you'd expect someone like me to say is, you've got to take more risk, take more risk, take more risk. The best work is all about taking risks. I actually don't want to talk about that today because I don't necessarily believe it. Taking risks for its own sake is actually stupid. What we're trying to do is minimize risk at all points of a campaign to ensure effectiveness. So I really want to talk about creative risk reduction, because there is a little bit of a dark, dirty little secret sort of about how agencies and clients work together. And that is, the fact is that we know as an agency that actually at the end of the day, we don't take the risks. It's not us that's taking the risk. As soon as we present a piece of work to a client, we know that as soon as they say yes, all the risk transfers from us to them. So we sort of try our best to empathize with that situation and try and create work that will allow it to have effectiveness in the world. But we do know that it's actually not. I mean, the risk is that we'll present something that's absolute rubbish and we'll get fired. But the truth is, we get fired for a number of reasons. So it's more of a case of trying to reduce that risk as we sort of go forward. So that's really what I want to talk about: how we make work impactful but reduce the risk of it. So the way we sort of think about it is this. We think about where risk exists. So there's it's kind of a very linear scale of this. So at one end of the scale, we know that if we create campaigns that people are expecting, that campaigns that kind of feel like the things they've seen or heard before from brands, we kind of fall into that wallpaper sort of space where it's just advertising, it makes no real impact, and we risk that nobody will notice it. Now that's a massive risk. The risk is that you're going to spend your business's money and get zero return on it, and that's really the risk we're trying to minimize. So at one end of the scale, we've got to be able to try and veer ourselves away from creating work that looks like every other piece of work, and as a brand, you've got to veer away from trying to put work into the world that feels very similar to everything else, because if it does, it's just not going to get noticed. Then at the other end of the scale, you've got the kind of more, the wildly outrageous stuff, the stuff that sounds and looks just kind of a bit ridiculous, the stuff that felt so right in a PowerPoint, but as soon as you see it in the world, you're going, what the hell did we just put into the world? And you have a risk at that end of the scale, which is that it's just got nothing to do with your brand. It just misfires. It just almost becomes a bit of a nonsense. So when we're trying to manage risk, what we're looking for is that kind of sweet spot in the middle where it doesn't look like the rest of the category. It doesn't look like the rest of the world. It's not expected by consumers, so it's forgettable, but it's also not just kind of ridiculous for its own sake. And that's really the space where the lowest risk exists. It's that new, exciting, interesting work that works hard for a brand. So that's really what I want to talk about, is how do we find ourselves in that middle space to make work that's not an eye roll moment at both ends of that scale. So I'm going to show you a couple of things. I'm going to show you 3 ways how we consider when we're trying to produce work that is right in the middle of that sweet spot, and how to manage the sort of rationalization of it. So when you're confronted with a campaign or a piece of creative for the first time, how can we make sure that we are in that sweet spot? And I'll show you 3 techniques that we've kind of built up to make sure we do that. And then I'll show you, as I said, that example of reducing risk when you're running campaigns through a very simple strategy. But before I do that, I'll show you a couple of sort of things. And I want you to sort of think how, when I show you these next sort of 3 pieces of work, how comfortable you would have been if this was a piece of work that you had created with your internal team or your agency, and how comfortable would you be taking this to your boss or taking this to your board? It's about finding that right sort of space of comfort. So when I go through these next sort of propositions of campaigns, just have a think about how comfortable you'd be feeling about this type of work. So the first one is, what if you sort of had this great idea as a marketer and said, I think we've got something really powerful here, and what we want to do is we want to make a political stand about race that we know will isolate a large part of our population. And how comfortable would you be thinking, shit, for the brand you work with, for the board you've got to get this signed off with, for your bosses that you've got to show, how comfortable would you be with that proposition going into a campaign? Is that the right amount of risk? Well, that's exactly what Nike did with their Colin Kaepernick campaign when I'm sure you guys, most of you remember, about 18 months ago, this footballer from the NFL in America made a stand against the pomp and ceremony of American football because to highlight the issues of race and justice in the NFL and throughout the country. And he lost his job for that. He was no longer able to play in the NFL. Now, Nike could have walked away from their sponsorship of this particular player at that point, but they didn't. They went all in with a big campaign through the US, where we all know racism is still a major issue, that basically said, believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Now, when they did that, they knew that there would be some part of the Nike consumers out there, dare I say, the Trump voters, that would have thought, no, this is the wrong stand for it. We're gonna isolate that part of the community. But then on the other side, they were really going to energize the part of the community that believed that what this pro footballer was doing was right. So it's a risk that they took, but they had to make the rational calculation of it. And after they ran that campaign, Nike's value went up 26 billion. That's what it was reported to go up with, because what they've done is they've created so much support on one side of the argument, it overshadowed any risk that they found on the other side of the argument. So I guess the point here is it would have been very difficult going into that sort of discussion, going in with that mentality, not really knowing what's going to happen, but there is super reward in taking the right type of calculated risk. Now think about this one. If you were inside your own business and you were trying to get another campaign signed off and you decided that the best way to do this was to say the word motherfucker in your next ad, would you be comfortable going to your boss and saying, you know what, I think the best idea we can do is to call our consumers motherfuckers? That's exactly what Brewdog did. Now, Brewdog's got a bit of a history in shock, so they're allowed to they've bought themselves a license to do this, but there's still a massive risk in doing this, isn't it? I mean, they were clever enough to cut the word off, so they never said it. They made us say it in our heads. But that's what they did when they launched Punk AF, which is an alcohol-free IPA. And I'm talking from London at the moment, and you could see these ads all over London. So that's, again, it's a big risk you're taking. Is this going to annoy people? Is this going to insult people? Or is this actually going to create enough people to get on side of this campaign that will overshadow those type of people that don't necessarily believe in this campaign? Now, taking that to your board is a hard thing, but walking back with the results is a great thing. And I have a pretty good a friend of mine works pretty hard on the commercial side of Brewdog. He told me that the Punk AF is absolutely exploding, and it is because, in a large part, to this kind of polarizing campaign that they knew going into it had some risk, but they also knew that that the reward would be much higher. Then the third and final example I want to show you is how comfortable would you be inside your business with your product if you had this great idea that you wanted to ask your consumers how they wipe their bums. How are they wiping their asses with your product? Granted, it's probably not going to be, it's probably product specific, but that's exactly what Andrix did a few years ago with the Scrunch or Fold campaign. So they went out into the world and basically tried to start this conversation around, do you scrunch or do you fold? And on the outset of it, you're thinking, yeah, that feels like, you can kind of almost imagine the internal discussions about, we need to take more risk. We need to do things that shock people. We need to do things to punch above our weight. And you can imagine how that agency team and that internal marketing team might have got to this as a proposition because they thought this is really going to start a conversation. And you can imagine that this felt like a great, exciting risk to take. But it was voted one of the worst campaigns ever. It completely, they folded it super quickly, but it didn't stop the agency losing their job and most of the marketing team having to find new roles in the business as well. It was quite simply not a conversation that consumers wanted to have. So it's really hard to sort of my point here is it's really hard to understand before you have to get these things into the world to try and analyze how much risk are we taking and is it the right type of risk? Is it, we're going to insult our consumers and call them motherfuckers? Is that the right level of risk, or something that even feels maybe less risky because it's so dedicated to the product or so close to the product? We're going to ask people how they wipe their bums, but can be an absolute failure and in all honesty a bit of an embarrassment for the brand. So how do we sort of do that? How do we know what just feels like risk and exciting because it's different and weird and outrageous, to opposed to something that's quite calculated and is actually going to be that magical spot where for every pound we put into media, we get so many more pounds back because it starts such a big conversation and it starts, it really gets noticed and punches above its weight. Because I guess the point is that reducing creative risk conversation down to how outrageous should our campaigns be is absolutely a nonsense. It's not about how outrageous your campaigns should be, because outrageous campaigns don't work on their own. You've got to have a campaign that resonates with consumers as well. So what we need to discuss is how to get results and reduce risk by finding that sweet spot. Because the truth of the matter is that nobody actually wants risk, right? We all say we want brave and risky campaigns, but we don't. We don't want risk. We want results. So it's about managing that risk. So as I said, I'll start to show you ways that we've found is the best sort of way to try and analyze pre a campaign going live whether we've got the best type of risk. So here's some techniques that I've kind of built up over the years to try and do that. The first one is, and I've got 3 of these. The first one is, there is a difference between buying or creating a campaign and how consumers in the real world consume it. There is a difference between the way our brains react to that pressure. One is you've got your job on the line, you've got your professional career on the line, and the other one is just someone walking down the street and seeing an ad or seeing something on their phone. So we've got to bear that in mind. We've got to bear in mind that something that feels really high risk to us because we've got to sign it off mightn't be high risk in the real world. And it's because of this concept. So in the last 20 years, we've all learned a huge amount about cognitive bias and how we are not actually the great, wonderful decision makers that economics once thought we were sort of 30, 40 years ago. And it all goes back to the work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman about how we react to different things and how we're always a little bit biased in different situations. One of the bias that they isolated in some of their tests in the early 2000s was this idea of familiarity bias. So we are we all have a familiarity bias. We're all drawn to things that we kind of recognize and know before inherently. We're drawn to them. It's like why we kind of all listen to the same sort of music that we've been listening to for a while. It's why it's easy to buy a pair of jeans that kind of feel like the other pairs of jeans in our closet. It's just an easier sort of decision for us to make. But what they found is when your cognitive load is high, i.e. you're under pressure, you're making, you've got to really think things through. You've got to basically, you're under a bit of a stressful situation. You're much more biased towards the things that feel familiar than you are in every day. So that's the environment of creating work within your marketing team, and that's the environment of trying to sign work off and put it into the world. It's about you're under that cognitive load, that stress, where this feels like the most important thing in the world, and therefore we are naturally drawn to make things that are feel more familiar to de-risk that situation. However, consumers in the world, when they're just in the wild, they're just looking at things and seeing things on their phone or on their TVs or whatever it may be, react differently because they're not under that cognitive load. There is absolutely no personal stress in seeing an ad from a consumer. So if you heard me talk the other day, I talk about this quite a lot, about how our brains react under different stimulus. So on this chart on the left, that is a picture of your brain when it's stimulated by something it's never seen before. And all that stuff firing up is dopamine. It's firing up in your brain, and it's for evolutionary reasons that we need to be more alert when we come across things that are new to us. So when we see things that are new and interesting in the world, our brain at a biological level, which we cannot help, just fires up and becomes more interested and more alert and more awake. When the brain on the right is what a brain looks like when it's stimulated by something that it's already seen before. There's not much action going on. So when the consumers are out there or people are out there in the wild and they are just viewing stuff, not under that cognitive load, they're much more alert and drawn to things they've never seen before. So there's a tension there. There's a tension between, under the pressure of everyday job and work, that we kind of feel ourselves being pulled to the left on that original chart, where we want to make things more familiar, but consumers are much more interested when they see things that aren't familiar. So my trick here is just to try and remember it, just to try and remember that's what's happening inside our brains at the moment. We're under this kind of cognitive load, and it's making us feel like we want to make things more familiar, but to reduce risk. However, as we know, if people have already seen it, that's actually a higher risk place to be because they're not going to take notice of our ads. So my trick here is just to remember it and make yourself try and find that beautiful space between this makes me feel really wildly uncomfortable and I don't want to do it, to this just makes me feel safe and happy. In the middle there is probably about the right spot. The next thing to think about is what we call sort of professional distortion. And professional distortion looks like this. This is the world that we live in when we're thinking about advertising or content or an activation or whatever it may be. The world kind of looks like this, or this is iStock's version of that world. It's scary, it's in a building, there are people looking at you, and you've got the insights people, you've got the board, you've got the financial director, and they're all looking at you and saying, asking you the sort of the tough questions about your campaign. And that is the world, unfortunately, which we have to all get great work into the world. When the agency and client teams come together, this is the world, this is the gauntlet we've got to run. And it creates us a little bit of professional distortion where inside this room, things just feel, they're all distorted by the reality of this room, by the pressure of this room. However, consumers don't see our work in this room. Consumers never enter this room. They live in wider culture. And what does wider culture mean? It means that consumers live closer in this world. This world is the world where a real president can actually tweet a picture of himself as Rocky Balboa. This is a real tweet by a real president late last year. So they live in a much wider cultural context where anything goes, where they can see anything they want online, where they are used to brands and action and consumers and Netflix and everything else, all that content that they see, their tolerance for weirdness, their tolerance for sort of strangeness is much higher. So we've got to be really aware that if we're in that sort of space of professional distortion, we've got to try and push the boundaries to make sure we explain as best as we can that right now we're sitting in a boardroom, but our consumers aren't. They're sitting in the wild, and the wild looks a little bit ridiculous. It looks like that. So professional distortion. As marketers buying creative work, we make decisions based on the reality of our corporate category context. So that's why you often get a lot of ice cream brands looking the same, a lot of car brands looking the same, a lot of whatever soft drink brands looking the same. It's because we all live in that sort of distortionate field of our category, our corporate environment, and so on. But consumers don't. Consumers don't live in that world. They just live in the broader culture world, and it means that they're much more open to new, strange, sort of wild ideas because they've got a president that's happy to put, post a tweet of himself as Ricky Baba. So the trick here is to always try and think about your concepts in broader culture context, not category context. And the third one, which I've only just recently found out about, but I've been putting into practice for the last 12 months, is to eat cake. So if you're trying to analyze the risk of a campaign, there's two different parts of the brain. This goes back to sort of, the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky about how our brains work. But we've got two parts of the brain. It's not the left and right like this chart shows, but we do have two systems, system 1 and system 2. System 1 is all gut feel. It's all involuntary. It's all effortless. It's how you drive a car to around the down to the shop. You don't have to think about it. It's in the memory. It just happens. It's completely intuitive. That's gut feel. And on the other side of the brain, you've got analytical thinking, which is that's where you've got to be really focused, where you've got to concentrate. That's when you're learning to drive for the first time, or you're trying to do long divisions and you haven't done it since school, or you're trying to analyze the risk of a campaign. So what happens when these two different systems in the brain start working is you get two different reactions. So the first reaction might be we're going to put an ad into the world that says, you're as sober as a motherfucker, is geez, really? The first initial reaction is just involuntary. It's system 1 just going, wow, are we really going to do that? And then system 2 needs to come along and say, okay, we could do that. And actually, we might offend some people, but is that going to be more or less than the amount of people that will love us for it? We've got to get into that analytical space to really analyze risk, not just that original gut feel, that sort of like that sort of reaction to it. And it works both ways. We've got to, because the gut feel and with Andrex might have been, this is great. This is what I wanted. I wanted risk. It feels like, I said create risk and we're creating risk with this. It feels outrageous. Let's do it. But the analytical brain might have turned around and said, is this actually interesting or is it just stupid? Do consumers actually want to have this conversation with us? Now, here's the interesting part. You've got two systems of the brain. One system takes more energy. Having low glucose in your blood prevents our brain from switching between system 1 and system 2 thinking. Basically, system 1, that gut reaction, doesn't take much energy. System 2 drains you of energy. It takes a lot. And not only to get into system 2, but to stay there takes a lot of risk. It takes a lot of glucose in the body. So it kind of makes making any kind of risk discussion before lunch a bit useless. So my advice here is if you're trying to get work signed off that you believe in, that feels a bit risky, make sure you've had a piece of cake and make sure you give your boss a piece of cake too, because more glucose in the system will allow them to stay into system 2 a bit easier. So when we're trying to manage and analyze risk, we want to find ourselves in that sweet spot where it's not too bland and it's not just outrageous. And that's really going to take analytical thinking. So we've got to ask ourselves, am I being biased right now? Am I just retreating to something that feels familiar because it makes me feel real more comfortable? Am I being swayed by my environment? Am I being swayed by traditional category tropes and other things that other brands are doing in that category? Or am I actually thinking about the broader cultural context where this communications will live? And finally, do I actually need a slice of cake right now? So that's how, there's some sort of tricks and techniques for trying to analyze risk, because it is, in a lot of ways, it's what we do. A lot of people think a creative director's job is to sit there and create crazy ideas and see how they fly. It's not. The way we do it is we get our creative teams to create all the crazy ideas, and then we're kind of the filter that's got to analyze each campaign that's been created and go, is this going to work? Is it effective? How do I manage that risk and reward sort of equation to get the right work out there in the world that's going to be effective for a brand that's not bland, but that's not outrageous or stupid? So I'm going to show you how you can do that in your own campaigns with a really simple strategy. So the question is not how outrageous should my campaign be, because that's going to lead you to scrunch or fold. The question is, how do I know this work will work? Will people believe it? Will people buy it? Will people be interested in it? And I think at the moment, in all our comms, at the moment, we've got an overarching problem with advertising and with content at the moment. And it's our single biggest issue is that that right now people don't trust advertising. And we've done a couple of studies that were done. We did one, ISBA did one, a lot of sort of big bodies did some studies in this last couple of years, and it found that actually trust from brands is at an all-time low, which is weird because brands for the last 10 years have been bending over themselves to tell us how they've all got purpose. And unfortunately, it's just not really landing with people. So I think we should be wise enough to know that people are probably really never going to think of advertising as the most trustworthy profession in the world. It doesn't need to be. It shouldn't be. There should be doctors and architects and people like nurses, especially at the time of as the times we face. But I do think that we shouldn't be the lowest. And actually, ISBA found that advertising is at an all-time low. It is seen by many as just irritating, irrelevant, and annoying. All that stuff where we think we're being clever, where we're following people around the internet, trying to sell them a mop that they bought 2 weeks ago on Amazon, is just kind of annoying, and it's just made us feel untrustworthy, like we're not starting a real conversation with consumers. And actually, last year, Ipsos Mori did a whole study into advertising professionals, which is us, which is you, and I hate to break it to you, we actually ranked for the first time as the least trusted profession below politicians. So that guy that is happy to post a picture of himself as Ricky Balboa, unfortunately people trust him more than us these days. Sorry to break the news to you. So if trust is at an all-time low, the greatest risk we've got at the moment is that we will spend our hard-earned marketing money, our media budgets, on content or advertising that just isn't trusted. That people think they just roll their eyes at it because they think, yeah, whatever, it's just words. It doesn't mean anything. So that's the biggest issue we have. That's the biggest risk we have at the moment. So I want to show you a really easy strategy, the most simple strategy we have to reduce that amount of risk. I call it the say it and prove it strategy. And it's really simple. Whatever you go into the world and you're willing to claim, unfortunately, because advertising and brands are at an all-time low when it comes to trust, we've got to prove it. It's no longer the world of us doing glamorous ads in magazines, 30, 40 years ago, and people just buy what we're willing to say. We're no longer willing to do it. The internet has told us not to trust anyone. So we've also got to prove it. So my recommendation to you is whenever you're going to go out there and make a claim, you've got to be able to save enough of your energy and efforts to also prove that you're worthy of that claim. And I'll give you a couple examples. So we worked with Richmond Sausages a couple of years ago. And they were the most popular, and they still are, the most popular sausage in the country, but they were an absolute free fall. They were losing 19% year-on-year revenue. That is absolute free fall for a brand. Like, jobs were on the line. It was extremely tough for Richmond. The category just shifted away from them. Craft was the rage. Their conversation wasn't working with consumers. They weren't thought of in a great light. They had a major trust issue. And it didn't take us long to sort of work that out. That they were, if you went online, you'd literally get comments like, this food is for the devil. I wouldn't even give it to my dog. And people were having a great laugh cooking Richmond sausages and showing everyone how much fat was pouring out of the bottom of them. So they had a major trust issue with consumers. They were basically spending their advertising online, and it just wasn't returning anything because no one was willing to believe anything from the brand. But they still were the biggest, despite losing 19% year on year. They were losing the biggest, although it was under threat. And so what they did is they created a campaign called Proud to be the Nation's Favorite, where they went out on TV and they had this fantastic ad. It was a TV commercial, and it tested extremely well. It was a great ad. They basically went out and said, we're the nation's favorite. We're still more loved than any other sausage brand in the country. We're still the nation's favorite, and we think you should get on board. And the ad tested extremely well. We saw the ad. We liked it ourselves. We thought it was great. And when they ran this ad for 6 or 9 months, they were really excited about the response. But despite all the testing, sales didn't stop falling. They continued to fall through the floor. And that's when they asked us to get involved. So we said to them, the first thing we need to realize is that in a world of declining trust, you're going out there and you're not really a trusted brand at the moment. I think the brand itself knew it. It wasn't a difficult conversation. They knew when you're losing 19% year on year, you kind of know you've got a problem. So we said, look, you're going out into the world and telling people that you're the nation's favorite, but they're just not ready to believe it. They're not ready to enter in that conversation because you're not trusted. So we had to, what our strategy was really simple. You're already saying it through TV. Let's use digital and prove that we're worthy of this title. If we can prove that we are a brand worthy of the title of the nation's favorite, we believe we can turn around this brand. And that's exactly what we did. So we went out and took a survey, and we basically found the other nation's favourites, professionals in the country. So we found out that lifesavers, that teachers, that nurses, all those jobs right now that we need more than ever, with a nation's favourite professions. These are the people that people really respected. And so as a brand, we decided we better prove that we're worthy of a title that these people already have. So we went out and we celebrated them. We put our money where our mouth is, and we supported local lifesavers. We supported nurses. We supported teachers. We celebrated them. We made great content. We brought some celebrities on board to really make a fuss about them, just so we could show that, look, we're not a brand that's just willing to tell you we're the nation's favorite. We're going to act like it, and we're going to celebrate other nations' favorite. And when we added this big content campaign, this big digital campaign to the TV ad, the brand instantly turned around. And it shows you the real power of proving what the claim you're willing to make, and the power of digital these days. Because after a 19% fall, that one campaign, when we added it for 6 months, we ran that second strand of Prove It when they were already saying it on TV. It brought in 2.2 million new consumers into the brand. We'd finally got the brand into a trusted position because we were showing it was worthy of trust. We proved to the nation that we were worthy of that title. And in fact, we reversed a 90% drop in revenue to 5% growth. When the client was talking us through this, there was almost a tear in their eye. They were just so happy that something could have such a big effect. And from there, we've really been realizing the power of the strategy I'm showing to you. Whenever we say it, we've got to prove it. So they were telling people that they were the nation's favorite, but they weren't ready to believe it. They have to prove it. They had to prove that they were ready to act like the nation's favorite to reverse the trend. And remember, when they were just saying it, sales didn't reverse. But when they added that Prove It, the whole campaign started working. All that TV spend started working so much harder for the brand. And that's really the risk, right? The risk is that we're going to waste our business's money by not doing things properly. I'll give you one more example before I leave you, because it's not just for sausage brands. So we work with a brand called Havana Club, which is a global rum brand, run by Pernod Ricard. And about 18 months ago, they came to us and said, look, we are they used to be a great brand, and still are a great brand, but they had sort of ceased to grow. They had really blown up in sort of maybe 10 years ago, on the back of this hipster culture, this hipster movement where, they were all about craft and heritage and so on. But every other brand has sort of started to catch up. So they were once a happy sort of hipster heritage brand, bright colors, Cuban, really happy sort of brand. The problem was that everyone else in the category sort of spied it, and they started doing the exact same thing, and there was just no more room to move. The conversation was just clotted, and unfortunately for Havana Club, they stopped growing. They got down to about 0% growth. And so we came and started talking to them about, well, what do we need to do? What risks do we need to take to start to reverse this? So we decided that the best thing to do was to take a bit of a risk here and to ignore the current audience. We said it's cluttered, it's too much on it. And to the brand's credit, this wasn't an argument. They were thinking the same thing, but we really needed to work out how. So we moved from talking to millennials and hipsters who really value craft and heritage and the humanization of products, and we found this new generation, Generation Z, what we call the street culture tribe, which were young people who had kind of rejecting those values of the hipsters and were actually the type of kids walking around with 100 logos. They liked brands again. They weren't all about trying to hide the brand that they were doing with or small logos. They were all about big logos. They were into fashion, rap music, and they didn't care and still don't care too much about craft credentials or the hipsterization of brands. And to be honest, if you want to learn more about this, we'll be talking about this next week as well. But that was the risk we took about how we energized this Generation Z, the street culture tribe within it to re-energize the brand. So the first thing we did was we just made the brand feel youthful, full of attitude, and dangerous. So we went out there and basically said to everyone, we are worthy. We are now a street culture brand. We are a brand worthy of the streets. We are the type of brand that says we're part of the street culture. However, the risk was that we were going to alienate the current consumers. That was a risk we're willing to take, but we couldn't risk also going towards this new consumer tribe who could have shunned the brand. They could have said, you're just reappropriating culture. You just kind of look like us. You're not really like us. So whilst we had to say it, we had to prove it. And the way we proved it with Havana Club was we set in motion a strategy that the brand team still today is just running with, and they're doing such a great job of this, where they're proving that they are willing to give back to this culture. They're proving they're willing to take a stake in the culture and not just sort of say, look at us, we're just like you. We're going to prove that we want to do things. And they started off on a collaboration. They started collaborating with local streetwear brands like Places Plus Faces, local or Daily Paper. They started sponsoring the up and coming rap stages at festivals, and they started doing collaborations. And that was fantastic, because even though those brands were not sort of household names, they weren't the Nikes of the world, and the rappers were up and coming rappers, it brought them, they were proving that they were valuable within that space. They were proving that they were part of this culture. And then what started to happen is that they allowed them to open up bigger conversations with bigger people. And since then, they've started to do bigger things with artists like Skepta here in the UK, and doing things with Drake globally. So they were able to, once they proved that they were worthy of this kind of this brand attitude, this tribe that they were trying to go after, they started to get more and more noticed. And I'm pleased to say that after 18 months, Havana Club 7, which was one of their more premium rums, that was the whole point of this campaign, was now in 12% growth globally. It's now, after going out there and saying it and proving it and doing all that hard work, they're back into growth. And the other rum brands are actually the ones that are struggling at the moment, because globally rum is still not in growth. So we've got to say it and prove it. So we said we were a rum for the streets, but we need to prove it and actually invest in street culture, fashion and music. So the moral of the story today, and I hope that's been kind of interesting, and I hope that's been helpful. I don't want it to sort of come across as sort of like a creative director going, no, you've got to take more risk. I'm really about the risk reduction, about trying to do things that get noticed and trying to manage that risk. So we're not pushed to a too safe to ground. So we are willing to be brave and do things, but we're not trying to push ourselves just to be outrageous for the sake of it, because that is a waste of money as well. So the sort of moral of the story, the creative risk taking is not about outrageous advertising. It's ensuring that you don't get fired for wasting your company's money. That's the biggest risk, right? The biggest risk we've all got is that we get fired because we do things that don't get noticed at either end of those scales. So there are techniques for improving your ability to analyze creative risk, and it really is about that. It's not about saying how outrageous is this. It's let's actually go ask ourselves, what's really going to happen if we put this into the world, into wider culture and wider context? Do we have something that's interesting here, or do we have something that's too safe, or do we have something that's just a nonsense? And there are strategies to enable you to reduce risk. And I think the most powerful one at the moment is to make sure, if you're going to invest in media and tell the world, tell your consumers that you are something, you've got to be able to back it up. Remember, advertising is an all-time low when it comes to trust. So make sure you've saved enough of your energy, enough of your budget to go out there and prove it. Because with that prove strand, you're really going to start to make every budget, every media budget or media dollar you spend work a hell of a lot harder for you. As I say, I hope that was interesting. That's me. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or direct on email. I'm happy to have any conversation with anyone who agrees or disagrees. It's just as much fun for me.
Cool, great. All right, thanks, Michael. So we've not got any questions through the Q&A yet, but I kind of wanted to put a question to Chris, which is more about kind of the insight we draw on just to understand the customers and to kind of how to understand what we think they'll respond to most, because that scale the scale that Michael talked about at the beginning, like placing us on there at the right point is always a tricky bit, and managing the balance between brand teams and creative teams. So we've talked about testing a few times, and to what extent do we listen to what the research is saying, or what the insights are saying? How do we pull out the right things to listen to?
That's a great question. So I think, where the starting place for great, brave campaigns, I think, is always insights. So if you don't have a strong insight that's informing it, you're never going to get to a breakthrough campaign. And I think it's one of the most overused words: insight, strategy, innovation, all said a lot, but misunderstood a lot. So, a powerful insight isn't an observation. It's not people do this. It's something that kind of strikes you, and it's something surprising and something that you feel you haven't heard before. And once you have a powerful insight, that allows you to then find the tension. How are you going to resolve that? And if you've got a powerful tension, and an insight that sets the creative teams up to create a campaign that is brave. If you don't have that, you're kind of asking creative teams to wander around in the dark and stumble upon something. A brief that says, give me a brave campaign, that's not reliant, whether the time invested to create a powerful insight and resolve a tension won't lead to great creativity. And then testing, there's a lot of examples of really famous campaigns that bombed in testing, and the consumers said it wouldn't work, and then went on to be one of the most successful campaigns in the world. So I think it's really powerful, but sometimes marketeers need to take risks, and you need to go out on a limb, and that really comes down to your company culture. So if you've got a company culture where you need collective wisdom and every single person needs to buy into what the idea is, it's really hard to get ideas through that are brave. And then sometimes you need testing to back it up to stand a chance of proving to your stakeholders. If you've got a company culture where you're allowed autonomy and empowerment, then you don't need that testing. If you've got the gut instinct that you know this is going to work, then you're allowed to move forward at pace and scale. So I think it really comes down to, testing is about the company culture that you exist in, and how much autonomy that you're allowed and how much risk that you're allowed to have within your organization.
There's an interesting little anecdote on that. It's called the ice cream. I think there's an ice cream study done on this, and they found that the bigger a group gets in making a decision, the more likelihood that decision, when it comes down to which ice cream should we buy for ourselves, is vanilla. So the bigger the group gets, the more vanilla you get. The smaller, if you've got a smaller working team that's going to decide which ice cream they're going to have for the whole team, you're more likely to have Rocky Road, chocolate chip, something more exciting. It was actually a study done by university to figure out why at a group level decisions kind of become more literally vanilla.
Yeah.
So, Michael, we got a question from Emma Inston. She said, the Richmond sausages prove it focuses on mood and championing other nations' faves. What does Michael think about brands proving it through real product features and benefits?
So I think the research on this is pretty good. Brand fame across the board are always campaigns that build brand fame are always more effective than any other style of campaign. That's been proved over and over and over again. Now the truth is that sometimes you can be famous for a product feature. Like that's that's not an unheard of thing. That your brand and your product features can be intrinsically linked. So an example of that might be I don't know, maybe Deliveroo or something like that, where their product features of how they can actually deliver to you fast and their tech is actually a big part of their brand, because without that it would sort of fail. In the case of Richmond sausages, that wasn't the case. The truth is, and I don't think they'll mind me telling you, is that there are better sausages on the market. They're more expensive sausages, but there are probably better quality sausages, quality sausages on in the market. So there was absolutely no point in us picking a fight with something that we'd already lost the argument for. And I would try and tell that brands a lot, and we often discuss that with brand directors. If you have picked a fight and you have already lost it, there is no point picking it again. Let's find another fight to win. Same thing with Havana Club. We kind of lost the hipster fight. So let's go pick another fight where we're guaranteed to win because there's no one else in the ring with us. So Richmond sausages couldn't pick the quality, the product credentials, the product features fight, because there were craft brands out there that could say, yeah, but our sausages are way better. So that is a fight that already lost. So they were best to pick a fight that the craft guys couldn't win, which was basically, yeah, but we're bigger. We're bigger than you, and we'll play to our strengths.
Just to add to that, I think, there are some categories where the product feature is incredibly important, say financial services, what interest rate I'm getting. But a lot of purchase decisions are made up of how I feel about something. It's got nothing to do with the product feature. It's at best mildly more interesting than the competitor. It's what it says about me and how I feel about it. So I think you have to really understand the category that you're operating in to understand whether you should go more product-led or more emotionally led. And as well, that's about the maturity of your brand within its life cycle as well, plays an important role.
Great. I've got another question here from Michael. So from Christina Ulesi, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She says, interesting about the tension between company culture and outside world culture. If the company culture is aligned with a very strong brand proposition, how do you move away from that, be more brave without damaging the brand?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that if you've got a brand culture that's very much aligned to your brand and it's working, then you've got a positive culture. But if your brand stopped working and it's aligned to the company culture, and the brand stopped working, maybe it's time to change the culture. So I don't envy that task, trying to change an organization's culture, that is for sure. But yeah, I think it's a question of, you don't want to be brave for its own sake. It's kind of what I was talking about with the Andrex example. That was just kind of trying to be risky for its own sake. So if you have a brand if you've got a proposition that is linked to your company culture and it's all beautifully working at the moment, it's actually probably not the right risk to take to try and break that just because you need to be more brave. But if the brand stopped working, possibly the culture stopped working because the whole thing is tied to that single proposition, it is something that you're going to need to try and move. And the only way I would suggest doing that is to try and get the people at the organization outside their field of distortion, their professional distortion, try and take them into the real world and show them like what the real world sort of looks like. Because that professional distortion thing I spoke about isn't kind of anecdotal. It's a pretty big force on how we make decisions in the world. We make decisions for the world, but we don't make them in the world.
I think a useful technique to that, getting stakeholders aligned to the real world, is get them out spending time with consumers. So not listening to some video of some video diaries or whatever study you've done. Actually get them to spend time with the consumers, and you'd be amazing how the penny suddenly drops and they realize who their actual customer is and what they need to do to connect to them. So that's a great technique I'd suggest for everyone to do. Something that we've done with many clients and something we're happy to set up if anyone's looking to do that. But spend time with your real consumers, and because we're 99% of the time, we are not the consumer. And so we need to get their world.
And I'll tell you about an error we made once, not doing that, where we had created a pen portrait of a new consumer, and we hadn't spent enough time with them. We created this whole pen portrait. We thought it was brilliant. It sounded absolutely perfect. We were about a week away from showing to the client, and we thought, let's go talk to some consumers and just talk to real people in the world and see how sort of close we are. And as we walked around and started talking to people on this retail safari, we realized this fucking consumer we've just invented doesn't exist. Like, we have to start again because we hadn't spent enough time with them. So it's a really good point to try and break out and do some retail safaris, talk to consumers and see what you can do, because you can get in a very narrow field of reference.
Well, I got a question here from Paul Myers. Chris, maybe you want to take this one. He says, interested in what you thought about the Moldy Whopper campaign. It felt like it was celebrated within the creative industry, but a huge risk in potentially putting off the final consumer. Did they win by proving it, or was it a conversation that people didn't want to have, like Andrex?
So I think, Burger King have taken a brilliant approach to constantly troll McDonald's, right? That is their strategy. So everything they do is going to be aligned to that. So, another example of them trolling McDonald's is every single ad that they made in the last 12 months, they hid the McDonald's quarter pounder behind it in the photo shoot. So they could reveal it at the last moment at the end of the year to say, our Whopper is so much bigger, you couldn't even see the McDonald's quarter pounder in it. So that is their strategy. As a brand, Burger King's budget is significantly less than McDonald's, right? Their only ability to win this race is to get talked about. So they have to continually punch above their weight, and they play the saliency game. So they don't really mind what they get talked about for, because they're so outgunned by McDonald's in terms of media spend. They don't stand a chance otherwise. So I think from my point of view, what they were doing was the right strategy. I would always say, when it comes to risk, it's easy to do campaigns that I would say are what I call say fuck in a church. Walk in a church and say fuck, and people will turn around and look at you. And that's great, but it doesn't link to any objective. You haven't achieved anything. So I think Burger King knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew why they were trying to get this campaign talked about. And ultimately, I think when we look at their share price at the end of the year, I think Burger King will do very well. So to answer the question, I think they were proving it, but that wasn't the point. They were just trying to get talked about.
So I think with Burger King, you've got to remember that was the one thing we're talking about because we're in the industry, but they play a volume game. I reckon they're on a calendar of about twice every month. They do something that's newsworthy. They have a great strategy. They don't make content, they make news. It's a much better strategy. Trying to make content is really hard. You've got to compete with Netflix. If you make news, the content takes care of itself because people are willing to share it. So, how they de-risk that situation. And you're right, maybe it won't go well. Maybe that particular moldy burger was misjudged. But because they're at such a high cycle of putting things into the world, it's one of 30 things they'll do this year, and therefore they've de-risked the situation, not putting all their eggs into one moldy burger basket.
Great, cool. Right. Well, I think it's time to wrap the session up. So I just want to finish off by just saying thanks to those of you who tuned in for the second webinar. As Michael's mentioned, we'll be talking same time next week, Wednesday, kicking off at 10 a.m. about Gen Z. So I'll let you have registration links for that. I also wanted to mention that we are preparing a COVID response planning sessions where we're working with senior management on scenario planning to help them manage their comms and activities during this period, and all the different stages as we move closer towards resuming normal service. So if you'd like to know more about that, get in touch. You can either get in touch with Michael, he's Michael at weareimpero.com, or I'm Coris, C-O-R-I-S, at weareimpero.com. And we also last week we spoke about MPD launches, and around that we're carrying out a piece of research, just really looking at people, marketeers' concerns and feedback and experiences into successfully launching MPDs. We'll be cross-referencing the research we're getting with other data from various sources to produce a report which we'll share back to people who get involved with that. So I'll also be sharing a link back to that, and it takes just under 5 minutes to fill out. So your feedback will be greatly valued as we kind of crunch that data and share that back to those people who got involved. So thanks again to those who tuned in, and yeah, we'll see you same time next week.
Thanks a lot. Hope it was great.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.